The name of this man is almost unknown today, but he could have been the one to receive the award for the largest incitement to murder in history. We're talking about Heinrich Kramer, the ideological mastermind and organizer of the witch hunt, an event that spanned more than 200 years and claimed tens of thousands of lives. But before we talk about it, let's first define what it's all about. Paganism in the Middle Ages was much less developed than it seems to us now. There were no extensive cults. People have already moved away from the old beliefs, but not yet they have reached the modern neo-paganism and Wiccanism. On the other hand, were they pure Christians? Well, in our understanding, probably not. The further away from the major cultural centers, the more superstitious people were, and the architecture of that time can quite often be found references to the green man, the pagan symbol of fertility. The peasants crumbled communion into the fields to get a good harvest. They believed in the evil eye, magic and the supernatural. They used special prayers and amulets to heal themselves or cause harm to another. In general, the people were characterized by magical thinking, but at the same time they were more like strange Catholics than anything else. Did they believe in witches? Well, probably not, rather than yes. And the word witch itself is quite vague. Who is she? An old woman who lives in the forest and collects herbs? Or does she live in the city and constantly calls out trouble to the neighbors? Or is it a young woman who scares with her sexuality? Does she believe in pagan gods, or is she an apostate Catholic who consorts with the devil? There has never been an exact definition. Kramer took advantage of this. Henry was born in 1445. He was from a poor family and decided to take advantage of the traditional social elevator for men of that time. He joined the Dominican order. By 1474, he graduated from the Latin school, where he studied philosophy and theology. In a sense, the successor to the Torquemada case, he has never been such a good boy. In the year of graduation, he was arrested for criticizing Emperor Frederick in a sermon, and in 1480 for embezzlement of money from the sale of indulgences. But apparently, the church considered his offences not too serious, because in the same a year later, he became the abbot of the monastery in Schlettstadt. At one time he served as an inquisitor. It was just at the beginning of the hunt for Jews organized by Torquemada. Henry investigated the case of the Converso murder of a child, which ended with the execution of 9 suspects. But Kramer was too proud to repeat himself after others, so he decided to find his own Jews and lead the hunt for them. He was probably a misogynist, so in his eyes witches were guilty of all sins. So as not to look stupid at the trial of those in whom normal people did not even believe, Kramer stocked up on a papal bull. It is not known why, but Pope Innocent VIII provided our fanatic with a document according to which the secular authorities should help the inquisitors fight witchcraft. Moreover, it is not clear exactly what actions they considered to be. Initially, no one believed in his nonsense. The case of the witches from the city of Innsbruck is indicative. Henry arrived there, found the witches, ordered their execution, and the secular authorities sent him away with his inventions. Because the case materials did not prove to the judges that if a church official believes in magic, then this gives him the right killing people. If you look a little into the earlier past, there were witch trials before, but they were conducted by secular authorities, and they have never been judged for magic as such. To send a person to court, it was necessary to prove the real harm that he had caused. The statements, "He looked askance at my cow and now she has no milk," were not taken seriously. Therefore, if we talk about the stages of the Overton window, ordinary people of that time were somewhere between unthinkable and radical. But in just a few years, Kramer led them down the path of acceptable, reasonable, popular and state norm. And in this he had 3 assistants. The Jews ran out, epidemics began, and printing developed. But about everything in order. After the failure in Innsbruck, Henry gathered his strength to take this fortress by storm for the second time. He probably realized that it was necessary to act through the general public, and not through officials. So first, he released a few manuals for inquisitors, and later he combined them into his famous work, The Hammer of Witches. Moreover, his misogyny is evident in the word maleficarum chosen by him, which clearly refers to the feminine gender, and not to the masculine or indefinite, suitable for both sexes. Printing spread this spiritual contagion first in Germany, and then in France and Italy. Of course, in order to gain people's trust, the treatise needed to add credibility. On the one hand, Sprenger, a well-known author of that time, was indicated as a co-author of the work, who probably didn't even know he was a co-author. And on the other hand, the structure of the book, which allegedly gave scientific and systematic character to the process. Allegedly, because the criteria of which were given so broad that anyone could be accused. The author, in fact, just took all the peasant superstitions and said, yes, it's true. And this marked the beginning of a mass hysteria lasting hundreds of years. People read, looked around, looked for traces of witchcraft and found them. And they put pressure on the authorities to protect them from magical evil and heresy. Henry himself tasted the first fruits. By the end of his working life, he boasted about the 200 witches he burned. It was a dubious achievement, but he was proud of himself. Since 1490, he was helped by the law of King Charles VIII of France against fortune-tellers, sorcerers and necromancers. He allowed the property of convicts to be confiscated and thus motivated the inquisitors to find them. But this broth still needed to be cooked to gain flavour and aroma. For the next 100 years, people got used to the idea of malicious witches, whom the devil helped spoil the lives of honest Christians. And then the plague, syphilis, wars and crop failures came to Europe, possibly related to a decrease in the number of people due to the plague and wars that would cultivate the land. People were scared and they were looking for the extreme ones. And since the Jewish issue was more or less closed by baptizing them into the correct faith, resettlement and cutting off supplies, witches came to the fore. They have become a symbol of all the riots that are taking place. They were accused of incest, bestiality, eating children and other things. All these fictional atrocities were the opposite of the order destroyed by epidemics. And it was at this time that witches turned from witches or herbalists into devil worshippers. From 1585 to 1660, there were 3 waves of witch hunts. And if earlier the number of convicts numbered in the hundreds, then in less than 100 years about 50,000 people died. It can be said that this is not much. But then, in general, the population on Earth was much smaller. People found the last one and using the hammer of witches convinced themselves that there are no good witches, and that mass killings will save the world. Murders, mostly of women, because they are stupider, more lustful, and their will is weaker. The main category of victims were wives or widows over the age of 40. Such evil mothers, a perverted image of caring and life-giving woman. At this time, the reverse process is taking place to what it was in Kramer's time. If earlier people and authorities had to be convinced of the existence of harm from witches, then in the 16th and 17th century, defenders of witches could already be afraid for themselves. There are cases when people who tried to stop the hysteria were themselves accused of being in the department or having ties with witches, and executed. You can name several victims of the madness of the crowd by name. Dietrich Flade ran a civil court and did not want to look for witches, for which he was accused of witchcraft in 1589. Georg Hahn was executed in 1628 for sympathizing with witches. Scholche Schweigel was killed in 1661 when he tried to interfere with the anti-Vedic processes. It is also possible to say in general about the increased level of cruelty of the church. At that time, the courts used torture everywhere. But there was a big difference between secular and ecclesiastical courts. Until the 15th century, the ecclesiastical court was much more loyal to prisoners. His goal was to obtain human repentance, and the death sentence was simply unprofitable for him, since he declared his powerlessness to find the way to the human soul. The secular court has nothing to do with it. I did not deny myself. And the suspects definitely preferred the first to the second. The situation with witches was different. Since their crimes were considered exceptional, they could be tortured as much as they wanted, beating out confessions and names imaginary accomplices. The intensity of hunting varied from country to country. It was worse where the local government was remote from the supreme power and close to the people, and infected by their panic. There were other motives for participating in this madness. The financial benefit was an excellent incentive for all participants in the process, from the executioner to the notary and the innkeeper. The top of the hierarchy thus increased their authority. In France, the processes were small due to its centralized power and developed administrative structure. England was the first country where the persecution of witches was legally stopped. In Germany, hunting was extensive, not at the same time, but by the end of the 18th century, it had stopped in all German countries. The most significant hunt in the British Isles was staged by King James VI of Scotland. Initially, he was not interested in witches, but everything changed when he arrived in Denmark to get married. Because of the storms, he couldn't go home right away, so he stayed in Europe. During the honeymoon, he talked a lot with enthusiastic hunters. His suspicion had been sharpened since childhood by the conspiracies surrounding his mother, and so new ideas fell into fertile ground. He decided that there was a satanic conspiracy around him, and the main Satanist is his cousin and rival for the throne, Francis, Earl of Bothwell. Shortly after the king's return, charges were brought against the count and 3 other women, and the king watched as, under torture, the count admitted that he was the head of the anti-royal satanic cult. This case was beneficial to him both from a practical and ideological point of view. The satanic campaign against him was proof of the divine source of royal power. Moreover, the snowball of accusations grew and the suspects found other suspects. In 1593, in the year of the witches, they burned on Castle Hill in Edinburgh, and the count escaped to Italy. His ascension to the throne of England a few years later gave way to English witch hunters. The most famous of them was Matthew Hopkins. One of the sons a priest, he boasted about 1,000 witches he had found, which was an unprecedented amount for a time span of 2 years. He worked as a hunter for less than 2 years and found more witches than the rest of the hunters in England in 160 years. How did he do it? Well, the judges had questions about it too. Questions about how real the testimony given under torture by sleep deprivation is, how effective the water test is, and whether a mole and a witch's mark are exactly the same thing. Because of all these awkward questions, Matthew had to end his career ahead of schedule, earning only £23, or £600–700 at its cost in 2011. After Hopkins' death in England, an epidemic of witch persecution spread to the colonies. Settlers in the New World used his book uncovering witches and suggested methods to reduce their numbers. Over time, people reached such a degree of hysteria that they didn't even need to look for anyone specifically. The world-famous story of the Salem witches began with the fact that the girls had a dream. It was the cold, hungry winter of 1692 to 1693. The Salem settlement of Massachusetts was very isolated and surrounded by unfriendly neighbors, Indians and the French. And because of this isolation, they were very afraid of starvation. And when the 2 sister girls started acting strangely, everyone immediately thought they were possessed by the devil, because the girls could not behave strangely from hunger or poisoning at all. Hysteria spread, along with the number of possessed. People do not like the unknown, so they immediately found the culprits, 3 local women hanged according to the testimony of children. But since the natural enemy, isolation and hunger, did not stop, the culprits had to be searched further. By spring, there were already more in prison, 100 people, and 20 of them were hanged. And the persecution mania began to spread further to neighboring settlements. Hysteria also stopped from above. In all countries, governance became increasingly centralized, and conflicts flowed into the sphere of foreign policy. And the institutions of the police and the army created a sense of security for citizens. Now the term witch hunt is used figuratively as an unsubstantiated accusation of a group of people. And this accurately describes the madness in the world started by Heinrich Kramer. Yes, it was he who turned the accusation in witchcraft from something strange and funny to real threat. It was his textbook that brought tens of thousands of people to the stake. And, although the number of his personal victims is small, it was he who launched the persecution pipeline and was indirectly responsible for thousands of broken lives.